Hello aspiring photographers, welcome to my channel. Today we'll try to understand 5 basics of photography: composition, exposure, aperture, shutter speed and ISO. It's going to be a fun-filled session today as I have included a lot of photographs as examples during the course of this tutorial. So what are we waiting for? Let's get started. These are the basic ingredients that makes up a good photograph. I have broadly classified them into two categories: composition and exposure. Composition is basically how you frame your subject. You know, whether you want to keep the subject in the middle of your photograph or on the left side or on the right side or wherever you want. But once you have taken a photograph, you can do very little editing of it as far as composition of a photograph is concerned. We'll talk about composition in details in later part of this video. Now let's talk about exposure. Exposure is made up of ISO, aperture and shutter speed. These elements you can easily edit, or to say post editing is very easy of these elements. There are a lot of post editing tools available on internet like Photoshop, Lightroom and many more. I personally like Lightroom as it is very easy to use. Now let's try to understand each of these elements in details. Let's start with the composition. Composition is the placement or arrangement of visual elements or ingredients in a work of art. In this case, it's a photograph. Composing an image is actually arranging elements within it in such a way that best describes your core idea. A good composition is very important for storytelling. Now let's talk about this photograph in terms of a composition. I took this photograph when I was in Cambodia. Here the subject is the monks. They were walking down the road when I took this picture. You can see it's a wide and a straight road, seems it's ending to the infinity. There is a palace on the left side and trees on the right side. I wanted to emphasize more on the monks, and in order to attract the attention of the audience towards my subject, I suppressed all other colors except orange. So the whole photograph is in monochrome or black and white except the monks. As a result of that, when you see this photograph, your attention will be quickly diverted to the subject. Now if I had framed this picture in such a way with monks on the left side, or if I would have framed it in such a way that I would have kept if monks on the right side, the composition wouldn't have come out that good. It totally depends on where you want to place your subject in order to come up with a good composition. Let's see few examples of a good composition and a bad composition. In this case, I would say the photograph is okay, but the composition is not that good, because in this case the subject is slightly on the left side of the frame, as you can see. Part of her thumb is missing here. Background is too blurry and you cannot see much of the details in the background. Now I'm not suggesting that a good composition is a one where you should always have the subject in the middle. No, it totally depends on the situation. Now let me show you an example of a good composition. This is a good composition, or I would say that this is a great composition. I took this photograph recently in Singapore when I was wandering in a park. Now why this is a good composition? Because on the left side there is a road, which is dry, dull and lifeless. Whereas on the right side you have water, which represents life, and you have trees separated by these safety bars in between. So it kind of tells a story that if you want to move from dryness and dullness towards life, you will have to overcome the barriers which are there in between. Well, that is about the story that this picture depicts. Moreover, there is a lot of symmetry in this photograph, and symmetry always attracts the human eye. If you look at the safety bars, first it's big, then it is getting smaller all the way up till the end. So all these things put together makes up a good composition in this example. Now we will move to the exposure. In photography, exposure is the amount of light per unit area reaching an image sensor as determined by shutter speed, lens, aperture and ISO. Each of the three aspects of the triangle relate to light and how it enters and interacts with the camera. It is at the intersection of these three elements that an image exposure is worked out. Most importantly, a change in one of these elements will impact the other. This means that you can never really isolate just one of the elements alone, but always need to have the others in the back of your mind. So in order to get a correct exposure, you should have proper setting of these three elements. Many a times you might have heard people saying that, this is an underexposed photograph or this is an overexposed photograph. Let's see what that exactly means. Now, this is an example of an underexposed photograph. Again, this could have happened because of any of the three reasons, like due to fast shutter speed or small aperture or low ISO. Let's see another example. This is an example of an overexposed photograph. Again, wrong setting of any of the three elements could be the reason. The third one is an example of a proper exposure. Now let me put down all three photographs so that we can easily compare them. I hope you would have got an idea about exposure. Now let's talk about each of the three elements one by one. Let's first start with the aperture. Aperture is a setting which controls the size of the opening of light which comes through to the lens. To put it simply, aperture is the opening of your lens which allows light to enter your camera. The bigger the opening, the more light will enter your camera, and the smaller the opening, lesser light will enter your camera. The size of aperture is measured by what we call a f-stop. In this example, the widest opening of lens has a f-stop of f1.4. Then you have f-stop of 2, so on and so forth. That means the smaller the f-stop, the wider the opening of your lens. Let me give you an analogy of a window. Imagine your camera is like a window with shutters that opens and closes. Aperture is the size of the window actually. If it's bigger, more light gets through and the room is brighter. Let me show you some examples. This photograph was taken at f-stop 1.8, meaning wide opening of lens. But remember, with wide lens opening, you will get more blurry backgrounds. In this photograph, you will notice that the background is very blurry because of wide aperture. This blurriness is called as bokeh effect. Here is another example of wide aperture photograph. Now let me show you an example of a smaller aperture opening. In this photograph, I didn't wanted to blur the background and wanted to capture the details behind. So I took this picture at f-stop 5.6. Therefore, we didn't get a blurry background and I could capture all the details behind. Initially, when you are learning or having started taking photographs, I would suggest you to use the creative modes and not directly jump to the manual mode. If you are taking portraits, I would suggest you to use your camera in aperture priority mode, wherein you as a photographer sets the aperture that you wish to use and camera makes a decision about what shutter speed is appropriate in the conditions that you are shooting in. You can still select ISO in aperture priority mode. So you have control whether you want a shallow depth of field, that means blurry background, or deep depth of field, meaning less or no blurriness. Now let's move to shutter speed. Shutter speed or exposure time is the length of time a camera's shutter is open when taking a photograph. Now coming back to our analogy of a window, the longer you leave the window open, it will allow more light to come in. It depends what kind of photograph you are taking. If you want to freeze the moment, then you should have a high shutter speed, Or if you want motion blur in your picture, you should use a low shutter speed. Now let's see few of the examples related to shutter speed. This is an example of a long exposure. I took this photograph with 2 seconds of shutter speed. That means my shutter was open for 2 seconds because I wanted to capture the moment of the seconds hand of this watch. Now this is another example of a long exposure shot, actually a 5-second exposure. My camera shutter was open for 5 seconds and I was turning the pages of the book when I took this photograph. Now let me show you an example of a high shutter speed. This photograph I took was with a shutter speed of 1/400. That means the shutter was open for 400th of a second. Because I wanted to froze the moment. So if you want to take a sharp picture, you should use a high shutter speed, as in this case. If you want to capture the motion, you can use shutter priority mode, which allows you to select the shutter speed while the camera adjusts the aperture to ensure correct exposure. Now let's talk about ISO. ISO actually stands for International Standard Organization, the main governing body that standardizes sensitivity rating for camera sensors. ISO in simple terms is the sensitivity of your camera to light. When you change your ISO setting, you are adjusting your camera sensitivity to light. Now increasing the ISO introduces noise in your photographs, or also sometimes called as grains. So it is always suggested to use the ISO value as low as possible. But sometimes you can't take a photograph without, increasing the ISO. For example, you are shooting in a night concert in very low light conditions. In such cases, you will have to bump up your ISO to higher values. Now let's try to understand that how noise is introduced when you bump up your ISO. This is a graphical representation of photograph in terms of data and noise. The blue bar represents data, whereas the red bar represents noise. First graph represents a photograph that was taken in low light conditions. So the highest value of data here is 4.5. Whereas let's say the noise was constant at, let's say, around 0.5. Now due to low light condition, you decided to bump up your ISO. So let's see what happens when you bump up your ISO. So as a result of bumping up your ISO, the highest peak of data is now represented by 45. So your data has been amplified from 4.5 to 45. Okay. As a result of increasing your ISO, your noise has also been increased from around 0.5 to 5. So this is how noise is introduced when you increase your ISO setting. Here is an example of a picture taken at different ISO: 100, 200, 400, 800 and 1600. In picture taken at 1600 ISO, you will notice a lot of grains and noise. So this completes our tutorial here. I hope my tutorials are helping you in understanding the basics of photography. Please subscribe to my channel, leave your comments, and do let me know if you want me to cover any specific topic. This is my Facebook page. You can connect with me on Facebook using this URL. Happy photo shooting, guys. See you later.